It's funny how silence can have a texture. The silence in this apartment is thick, dusty, like an old blanket you find in the attic. It's a stark contrast to the noise that used to fill my life, the constant hum of servers, the excited chatter of my team, the ringing of phones that meant another investor was on the line, another deal was closing. And then there was the other noise, the better noise. The sound of my kids' laughter echoing down the hallway of our old house, the gentle murmur of my wife's voice as she read them a bedtime story. Now there's only this heavy, suffocating silence, punctuated by the groan of the building's old pipes and the distant wail of a siren. I sit here, on this lumpy sofa that I bought from a second-hand store, and I trace the rim of a chipped coffee mug. This mug is one of the few things I have left from that life, a relic from a time when my biggest worry was whether the espresso machine in our gourmet kitchen was calibrated correctly. My wife gave it to me. It says "World's Best Coder" on one side. I used to think it was a cute, ironic gift. Now it just feels like a cruel joke. The world's best coder who couldn't secure his own family's future. The architect of a brilliant piece of software who couldn't build a life that would last. The beginning of the end wasn't a sudden explosion. It was more like a slow leak, a gradual deflation of everything I had built. My startup, ConnectSphere, was my third child. I'd conceived it in my garage, nurtured it with late nights and endless pots of coffee, and watched it grow into something beautiful and promising. We were going to revolutionize social networking, create a platform that was more intuitive, more private, more human. For a while, it felt like we were on the cusp of doing just that. We secured seed funding, then a Series A round that made headlines in the tech blogs. We had a beautiful office with glass walls and a fully stocked kitchen. We were the darlings of the tech scene, the ones to watch. My wife was my biggest cheerleader in those early days. She'd bring me dinner at the office, listen patiently as I ranted about bugs and server loads, and she'd smile that smile that always made me feel like I could conquer the world. She believed in me and my vision, and her belief was the fuel that kept me going. We had a beautiful life, or at least I thought we did. A sprawling house in the suburbs with a big backyard for the kids to play in, 2 cars in the garage, vacations to exotic places. We had all the trappings of success, all the things that are supposed to make you happy. But the more the company grew, the more I disappeared. I was physically present, but my mind was always elsewhere, lost in lines of code, in pitch decks for investors, in the endless firefight of running a fast-growing tech company. I'd be at the dinner table, and my kids would be telling me about their day at school, and I'd be nodding and smiling, but all I could think about was a critical server issue or a looming deadline. My wife started to notice. Her smiles became a little more forced, her touches a little less frequent. The questions started, gentle at first, then more pointed. "When are you coming home? Can you please put your phone away? The kids miss you." I'd always have an answer, an excuse. "Just one more email, honey. This is important. It's all for us, for our future." I convinced myself that I was building a legacy for them, that the sacrifices I was making now would pay off 1,000-fold down the line. I was so focused on the destination that I didn't realize I was leaving my family behind at the starting line. The pressure was immense. The venture capitalists who had poured millions into ConnectSphere weren't just investors. They were masters, and I was their servant. They demanded growth, user acquisition, engagement metrics. Every board meeting was a high-stakes poker game where I had to bluff and posture and pretend that everything was going according to plan, even when it wasn't. The tech world is a brutal arena. You're either a unicorn or a ghost. There's no in-between. We were chasing that unicorn status, and the chase was all-consuming. I started to make compromises. We pushed out features that weren't ready, sacrificing quality for speed. We burned through cash at an alarming rate, hiring too many people too quickly, spending lavishly on marketing campaigns that didn't deliver the promised returns. The initial buzz around ConnectSphere started to fade, replaced by a growing chorus of criticism. Users complained about bugs, about the cluttered interface, about our constantly changing privacy policies. We were losing the very thing that had made us special in the first place, our focus on the human element. My wife tried to warn me. She saw the cracks long before I did. She saw the exhaustion in my eyes, the way my hands trembled when I held my coffee cup, the way I'd snap at the kids for no reason. She begged me to slow down, to take a step back, to delegate more, but I couldn't. I was the captain of the ship, and I was convinced that I was the only one who could steer it through the storm. I was arrogant. I was foolish. I had surrounded myself with a team of brilliant people, but I was too proud to listen to their concerns, too afraid to admit that I didn't have all the answers. The financial strain started to mount. We were running out of runway, and our attempts to secure a Series B round were met with polite rejections. The VCs who had once sung my praises now looked at me with cold, calculating eyes. They saw me not as a visionary, but as a liability, a bad investment. I started to lie to my wife. I'd tell her that everything was fine, that we were just going through a rough patch. I'd show her a doctored spreadsheet that painted a rosy picture of our finances, a carefully constructed illusion to mask the terrifying reality. I was so desperate to maintain the facade of success, so terrified of admitting failure, that I betrayed the one person who had always been in my corner. The debt started to pile up, not just for the company, but for us personally. I had poured our life savings into the business, remortgaged our house, taken out personal loans. I had gambled everything on a single roll of the dice, and the dice were not in my favor. The day it all came crashing down is a blur of disjointed images and sounds. The emergency board meeting, the stony faces of the investors, the cold, clinical words of the CEO they had brought in to replace me. "We're shutting it down. The company is insolvent. You're being let go." I walked out of that glass-walled office in a daze, clutching a cardboard box with my world's best coder, mug, and a few other personal effects. I felt like I was floating, like I was watching a movie of someone else's life. The drive home was the longest of my life. With every mile, the reality of my failure sank in a little deeper. I had not only lost my company, my dream, my reputation. I had lost our home, our savings, our future. I had failed my family. And as I pulled into the driveway of the house that was no longer really ours, I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I was about to lose them too. I saw her face through the window, her expression a mixture of fear and pity. And in that moment, I knew that the silence that was about to descend upon my life would be the most deafening sound I had ever heard. The startup wasn't just a business. It was my identity. It was the answer I gave when people asked what I did. It was the source of my pride, my ambition, my self-worth. And when it was gone, I was nothing. A hollowed-out shell of the man I used to be. The days that followed were a waking nightmare. The calls from creditors, the lawyers, the bankruptcy proceedings, the shame of having to tell my friends and family that I had failed. But the worst part, the part that still haunts my dreams, was telling my wife. I remember her sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cold cup of tea, her face pale and drawn. I stumbled through the words, the confession of my lies, my deceit, my catastrophic failure. I watched as the last glimmer of hope in her eyes was extinguished, replaced by a look of profound, bottomless disappointment. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the trust I had broken, the years of her life I had wasted. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. She just sat there in that heavy, suffocating silence, and I knew that our marriage was over. She deserved better than a man who had built his dreams on a foundation of lies. She deserved a partner, not a project. And I, in my blind ambition, had become a project that had failed. She left a week later. I came home from a soul-crushing meeting with the bankruptcy trustee to find a note on the kitchen counter. Her handwriting, once so familiar and comforting, now looked like a foreign script. The words were simple, direct, and utterly devastating. "I can't do this anymore. The kids and I are going to my sister's. I'll be in touch." And just like that, the noise was gone. The laughter, the stories, the arguments, the love, all of it gone, replaced by this thick, dusty silence. The house, once a home, was now just a collection of empty rooms, each one a monument to my failure. I'd walk through the hallways and see ghosts of my former life. My son's Lego creations still scattered on the living room floor. My daughter's drawings taped to the refrigerator. My wife's favorite throw blanket draped over the arm of her reading chair. Each object was a fresh stab of pain, a reminder of what I had lost. And as I sit here now in this cramped, soulless apartment surrounded by the wreckage of my life, I can't help but wonder if there's a way back. Not to the money, not to the success, but to the man I was before the startup, before the ambition, before the lies. The man my wife fell in love with. The man my kids deserved as a father. I don't know if it's possible. I don't know if I have the strength, but I know that I can't live in this silence forever. I have to find a way to fill it, not with the noise of success, but with the quiet hum of a life rebuilt, a life redeemed. The world's best coder is dead, but maybe, just maybe, the man, the husband, the father can be resurrected. The journey from the top of the tech world to the bottom of this lumpy sofa was surprisingly quick. It felt like I was in a high-speed elevator and someone had cut the cables. One moment, I was looking out at a panoramic view of the city from my corner office. The next, I was staring at a stained ceiling in a one-bedroom apartment with a view of a brick wall. The irony is, I was so obsessed with the concept of risk management in my business. I had charts and projections for every possible market fluctuation, every competitor's move. But I had no risk management plan for my own life, for my family. I had leveraged everything, our home, our savings, our future, on the single volatile stock of my own ego, and the market had crashed spectacularly. After my wife left, the days bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of waking up to a crushing weight on my chest, staring at the ceiling for hours, and then finally dragging myself out of bed to face another day of emptiness. The apartment became my tomb. I ordered takeout because the thought of going to the grocery store and seeing other families, happy families, was unbearable. I let the dishes pile up in the sink, a greasy monument to my apathy. The calls from creditors were relentless. I changed my number, but they found me. They were like vultures, circling a dying animal. Each call was a fresh wave of shame and humiliation. I, the man who had once negotiated multi-million-dollar deals, was now begging for a payment extension on a credit card bill. My relationship with my kids became a series of stilted, heartbreaking video calls. They were with their aunt in another state. They were safe, they were loved, but they were not with me. My son, who used to look at me with such adoration, now had a guarded look in his eyes. My daughter, my little princess, would ask me when I was coming to get them, when we could go back to our old house. And I would have to lie to them, tell them soon, knowing that soon was a lifetime away. Each call was like a knife twisting in my gut. I was their father, their protector, and I had failed them in the most fundamental way. I had taken away their home, their stability, their sense of security. The guilt was a physical thing, a heavy cloak that I couldn't take off. My wife and I communicated through terse, formal emails, mostly about logistics concerning the kids. There was no anger in her words, no bitterness, just a cold, heartbreaking distance. It was as if the years we had spent together, the love we had shared, had been erased, wiped clean by the acid of my failure. I knew she was hurting too. I had not only destroyed our financial life, I had destroyed her trust, her faith in me. And that was a debt I could never repay. I tried to find work. I sent out my resume to dozens of tech companies, but my name was toxic. The spectacular collapse of ConnectSphere was a cautionary tale in the industry, and I was the protagonist of that tale. The few interviews I managed to get were humiliating. I'd sit across from some young, arrogant CEO who would look at me with a mixture of pity and contempt. They didn't see a talented coder, a visionary leader. They saw a failure, a has-been. The rejection letters piled up, each one another nail in the coffin of my career. I started to lose hope. The silence in the apartment grew louder, more menacing. It whispered to me in the dead of night, telling me that I was worthless, that I had ruined everything, that my family was better off without me. I started to think about ending it all. The thought was a seductive one, a siren song promising an end to the pain, the shame, the guilt. I stood on the edge of a bridge one night, the cold wind whipping at my face, the dark water of the river calling to me. I thought about my kids. I pictured their faces, their laughter, their bright, innocent eyes, and I knew I couldn't do it. I couldn't inflict that kind of pain on them. I couldn't be a coward. I had to find a way to live, not just for myself, but for them. I had to show them that it was possible to fall and get back up, to make mistakes and learn from them. That was the night I hit rock bottom, and in a strange way, it was liberating. When you have nothing left to lose, you have everything to gain. I realized that my obsession with success, with building a legacy, had been a form of imprisonment. I had been so focused on the future that I had completely missed the present. I had been so busy chasing a fleeting, ephemeral dream that I had neglected the real, tangible love that was right in front of me. I decided to start over. Not as the CEO of a hot new startup, but as a man, a father, a human being. I sold what little I had left, my fancy watch, my designer clothes, my laptop. I used the money to buy a cheap, used car and a plane ticket. I was going to see my kids. I didn't have a plan. I didn't know what I would say to them or to my wife. But I knew that I had to be there. I had to show them that I was still their father, that I still loved them more than anything in the world. As I drove away from the city that had been the backdrop to my rise and fall, I felt a strange sense of peace. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with obstacles and challenges. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was driving in the right direction. The silence was still there, but it was different now. It was no longer a suffocating blanket, but a clean slate, a blank canvas. And on that canvas, I was going to paint a new picture of my life. A simpler, more honest, more human picture. A picture where success wasn't measured in dollars and stock options, but in moments of connection, in acts of love, in the quiet joy of being a father. It wouldn't be easy. But as I watched the city skyline disappear in my rearview mirror, I knew, with a certainty that warmed me to the core, that I was finally on my way home. The drive was long, a pilgrimage of penance across miles of anonymous highway. Each mile marker I passed felt like a small victory, a step away from the man I had become, and a step closer to the man I needed to be. The car was a rattling tin can, a far cry from the sleek German-engineered machine I used to drive, but it felt more honest. Its dents and scratches were a reflection of my own battered state. For the first time in years, I was truly alone with my thoughts, with no emails to answer, no meetings to attend, no fires to put out. The silence of the open road was a welcome respite from the oppressive silence of my apartment. It was a thinking silence, a healing silence. I replayed the last few years in my mind, not with the self-pity and anger that had consumed me before, but with a new, painful clarity. I saw myself at the dinner table, scrolling through my phone while my daughter tried to show me a drawing she had made. I saw the look of disappointment on her face, a look I had been too blind to notice at the time. I saw my son after his soccer game looking for me in the crowd of parents and seeing only an empty space where I should have been. I had been there, but I hadn't been present. I was a ghost in my own family. The memories were like shards of glass in my heart, each one a reminder of my profound selfishness. I had told myself that I was doing it all for them, but that was a lie. I was doing it for me, for my ego, for the thrill of the chase, the validation of success. I had treated my family like an afterthought, a supporting cast in the movie of my life. And now, the star of the show was a broken man driving a beat-up car to beg for a walk-on role in the lives of the people he had abandoned. I arrived at my sister-in-law's house late at night. The lights were on, casting a warm, inviting glow on the lawn. For a moment, I just sat in the car, my heart pounding in my chest. What if they didn't want to see me? What if my wife slammed the door in my face? I deserved it. I deserved all of that and more. But the thought of my kids sleeping in that house, so close and yet so far away, gave me the courage to get out of the car. I walked up the driveway, my legs feeling like lead. I knocked on the door, my hand trembling. The door opened, and there she was, my wife. She looked tired but beautiful, more beautiful than I had ever seen her. There were no words, just a long, heavy silence. But it was a different kind of silence than the one I had grown used to. This one was filled with unspoken emotions, with years of shared history, with the ghost of a love that I had tried so hard to kill. She didn't slam the door. She just stood there, looking at me with those eyes that had once held so much love and admiration, and now held only a deep, weary sadness. And in that moment, I knew that this was going to be the hardest thing I had ever done. Harder than any board meeting, harder than any pitch to investors, harder than admitting to the world that I had failed. I had to prove to her and to myself that I was worthy of a second chance. The first few days were excruciating. I was a guest in my own family's life. I slept on the couch in the living room, a thin, scratchy blanket my only comfort. I'd wake up early before anyone else and just sit in the quiet of the pre-dawn darkness, listening to the sounds of the house waking up. I'd hear the floorboards creak upstairs, the soft murmur of my wife's voice as she woke the kids, the thud of little feet on the floor. These were the sounds I had taken for granted, the soundtrack of a life I had thrown away. My kids were wary of me at first. My son, in that way that young boys have of trying to be strong for their mothers, was openly hostile. He'd ignore me when I spoke to him, give me one-word answers, and look at me with a coldness that broke my heart. My daughter was more forgiving, but there was a new shyness in her, a hesitation that had never been there before. She'd hug me, but it was a quick, tentative hug, not the full-body, running-leap hugs she used to give me. I didn't push. I knew I had to earn their trust back, one small, patient step at a time. I started with the little things. I'd make them breakfast in the morning, packing their lunchboxes with little notes that I'd draw silly cartoons on. I'd help them with their homework, something I had always been too busy to do before. I'd take them to the park, and I'd actually play with them, pushing them on the swings, throwing a baseball with my son, my phone left behind in the car. I was fully present for the first time in a long, long time. And slowly I started to see a change. My son's hostility began to thaw, replaced by a grudging acceptance. He'd start to tell me about his day, about his friends, about the video game he was playing. My daughter's hugs became a little longer, a little tighter. The shyness in her eyes was replaced by a glimmer of the old, unconditional love that I had so carelessly discarded. My wife watched all of this from a distance, her expression unreadable. We barely spoke. Our conversations were limited to the practicalities of a shared living space. "I'm going to the store, do you need anything?" "The dishwasher is finished." It was a strange, sterile dance of politeness, a stark contrast to the easy intimacy we had once shared. But I knew that words were not what she needed from me. She needed to see a change. She needed to see that I was not the same man who had walked out of that glass-walled office, a failure in every sense of the word. I started looking for work again, but this time my approach was different. I wasn't looking for a high-powered, high-paying job in the tech industry. I was looking for a job, any job that would allow me to provide for my family, to start paying off the mountain of debt I had accumulated. I swallowed my pride and took a job at a local electronics store, repairing computers. It was a humbling experience. I, the man who had once built a multi-million-dollar software company from the ground up, was now troubleshooting Wi-Fi problems and removing viruses from laptops for minimum wage. But I didn't care. The work was honest, and at the end of the day, I could come home to my kids, tired but with a clear conscience. I started to rebuild my life brick by painful brick. I created a budget, a real one this time, not the fantasy numbers I had used in my pitch decks. I tracked every penny, every expense. I cut up my credit cards. I started to chip away at the mountain of debt, one small payment at a time. It was a slow, arduous process, but with each payment I felt a little bit of the weight on my shoulders lift. I was taking responsibility for my actions, for my failures. I was cleaning up my own mess. My wife started to notice. I'd see her looking at me, a flicker of something in her eyes that I couldn't quite decipher. One evening after the kids were in bed, she found me at the kitchen table, hunched over a pile of bills, a calculator in my hand. She sat down across from me, a cup of tea in her hands. The silence between us was different this time. It wasn't angry, it wasn't cold, it was thoughtful. She asked me about my day, about my job, and for the first time in months we had a real conversation. I told her about the challenges of the job, about the humbling experience of starting from the bottom. I didn't try to sugarcoat it, I didn't try to make excuses. I was just honest, and she listened. She didn't offer any words of comfort or encouragement, but she listened. And that was enough. It was a start. A tiny, fragile seed of hope planted in the barren ground of our broken relationship. I started to rediscover the simple joys of life, the things that had been lost in the shadow of my ambition. The taste of a home-cooked meal, the warmth of the sun on my face, the sound of my children's laughter. I realized that my pursuit of passive income had been anything but passive. It had been an active, all-consuming war that had taken me as its prisoner. The freedom I had been chasing was a mirage. True freedom, I was beginning to understand, was not about having enough money to do whatever you want. It was about being present in your own life, about being connected to the people you love. It was about finding joy in the ordinary, in the mundane, in the quiet moments that make up a life. One weekend, I took the kids camping. We didn't have a fancy tent or expensive gear. We had a cheap tent from a discount store, and we cooked hot dogs over a campfire. We slept under the stars, and I told them stories, not about business or technology, but about knights and dragons and magical quests. And as I lay there in the quiet of the forest, with my son and daughter sleeping soundly on either side of me, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in years. I had lost everything. My company, my fortune, my home, my reputation. But in losing everything, I was starting to find myself. I was starting to find the man I was meant to be. A man who understood that the greatest investment you can ever make is in the people you love. A man who understood that the most valuable stock you can own is the love of your family. A man who was willing to do whatever it took to earn back that love, one day at a time. The road ahead was still long and uncertain. But for the first time, I had a clear destination in mind. It wasn't a corner office with a panoramic view. It was a home, a real home, filled with love and laughter and the beautiful, chaotic noise of a family, and I was going to get there, no matter what it took. The journey back was not a straight line. There were days when the old feelings of shame and despair would creep back in, when the weight of my past failures felt too heavy to bear. I'd see a commercial for a new tech gadget or read an article about a successful startup, and a bitter pang of envy would hit me. It was a ghost of my old life, a reminder of the man I used to be. But then I would look at my kids, at the new, tentative trust in their eyes, and I would remember why I was doing this. I was not just rebuilding my own life. I was rebuilding their world, a world that I had shattered. Their world was my true north, my compass, and it always pointed me back in the right direction. The job at the electronics store was a masterclass in humility. I dealt with angry customers, condescending managers, and the mind-numbing boredom of repetitive tasks. But it was also a place of unexpected grace. I met people from all walks of life, people with real problems, not the first-world problems of the tech bubble I had been living in. I heard stories of struggle, of resilience, of quiet dignity. It was a much-needed dose of perspective. My coworkers were a motley crew of college students, retirees, and people like me who were just trying to make a living. They didn't care about my past. They didn't know or care that I had once been a tech CEO. They just knew me as the guy who was good at fixing computers and who always shared his lunch. In a strange way, I found a sense of community there, a sense of belonging that I had never truly felt in the cutthroat world of startups. My wife and I started to talk more. The conversations were still cautious, like two people learning to dance together again after a long time apart. We talked about the kids, about our finances, about the future. But we also started to talk about the past, about the things we had never said, the resentments that had festered in the silence. It was painful, like reopening a wound to clean it out, but it was necessary. I apologized. Not a blanket, "I'm sorry for everything," but a specific, heartfelt apology for my lies, for my neglect, for my arrogance. I took full responsibility for my actions without any excuses or justifications, and I saw something shift in her eyes. The wall that she had built around her heart began to crumble, brick by brick. We started to do things together as a family again. We'd go for hikes in the nearby state park, have picnics by the lake, and have family movie nights with a big bowl of popcorn. They were simple, inexpensive things, but they were filled with a richness and a joy that our extravagant vacations had never had. I was learning that connection wasn't something you could buy. It was something you had to build, one shared moment at a time. One afternoon, my son came home from school with a troubled look on his face. He told me that some kids at school had been teasing him, calling his dad a loser because I worked at a repair shop. The old me would have been filled with rage and shame. But the new me, the man who was learning to separate his self-worth from his net worth, just hugged him tight. I told him that there was no shame in honest work, no matter what that work was. I told him that a man's worth is not measured by the size of his house or the car he drives, but by his character, by his integrity, by the way he treats the people he loves. I don't know if he fully understood, but he looked at me with a new kind of respect in his eyes. And in that moment, I felt more successful than I ever had in any boardroom. A few months later, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, my wife came to me with a look on her face that I hadn't seen in years. It was a look of hope. She told me that she had been thinking and that she was tired of living in limbo. She wanted to go home, not to the big, empty house in the suburbs that was now a monument to our past life, but to a new home, a home that we would build together. She had found a small, two-bedroom apartment for rent in a nearby town. It was nothing fancy, but it was clean, it was affordable, and it was a place where we could be a family again. I looked at her, my heart filled with a gratitude so profound that it brought tears to my eyes. She was giving me a second chance, a real second chance. She was choosing to believe in me again, not because I was successful or rich, but because she saw the man I was trying to become. Moving into that small apartment was one of the happiest days of my life. It was a tight squeeze, and we had to be creative with our space, but it was our space. It was a home filled with love, with forgiveness, with the promise of a new beginning. We didn't have much, but we had each other. And for the first time, I understood that was all that really mattered. The silence was finally gone, replaced by the beautiful, chaotic, wonderful noise of a family. The journey was far from over. The mountain of debt was still there, a constant reminder of my past mistakes. But it no longer felt insurmountable. It was just a problem to be solved, a challenge to be met. And this time I wasn't facing it alone. I had my family by my side, and with them I knew I could conquer anything. I had lost my startup, but I had found my soul. I had lost my fortune, but I had found my true wealth. I had lost my way, but I had found my way home. Life in the small apartment was an adjustment, a lesson in humility and perspective. Our old house had rooms we barely used, cavernous spaces filled with expensive furniture that served more as status symbols than as functional pieces of a home. Here, every square inch was precious. The kitchen table doubled as my desk and the kids' homework station. The living room was also our playroom, our movie theater, and on some nights when my son had a friend over, a makeshift bedroom. We were literally and figuratively closer than we had ever been before, and in that closeness we began to heal. The lack of material possessions was liberating. We no longer had the pressure of maintaining a certain lifestyle, of keeping up with the Joneses. Our weekends were no longer spent on expensive outings or shopping sprees. Instead, we discovered the simple pleasures that had been hiding in plain sight all along. We spent hours at the local library, each of us lost in our own world of books. We'd have picnics in the park, our laughter mixing with the sound of children playing. We rediscovered the joy of cooking together, the small apartment filled with the delicious aroma of a shared meal. These were the things that built a family, not the extravagant vacations or the designer clothes. These were the moments that mattered, the memories that would last a lifetime. My relationship with my wife continued to mend, slowly, carefully. It was not a fairy tale romance, a sudden, dramatic reunion. It was a quiet, steady process of rebuilding trust, of learning to communicate again, of forgiving each other for the hurts of the past. There were still difficult days, days when the old resentments would surface, when a careless word would open up an old wound. But we learned to navigate those moments with a new honesty and a new vulnerability. We learned to listen to each other, to really listen, not just to the words, but to the emotions behind them. We were no longer two separate entities, living parallel lives under the same roof. We were a team, a partnership, united by a shared history and a shared hope for the future. I continued to work at the electronics store, my small, steady paycheck a lifeline in our new, frugal reality. I took on extra shifts whenever I could, and I started doing freelance coding projects on the side, using my old skills to build a small but growing stream of income. It was a far cry from the millions of dollars I had once managed, but it was honest work, and it was enough. I was providing for my family, and that gave me a sense of pride and purpose that my old life, with all its glamour and prestige, had never truly given me. My kids were thriving. They had adapted to our new life with a resilience that amazed me. They missed their old house, their old friends, but they were happy. They had their parents back, both of us, fully present and engaged in their lives. I was no longer the distracted, stressed-out father who was always on his phone. I was the dad who coached my son's soccer team, the dad who built elaborate forts out of cardboard boxes for my daughter, the dad who was always there for a hug, a story, or a shoulder to cry on. I was finally the father they deserved. One evening, I was helping my son with a school project on financial literacy. He had to create a budget for a fictional family, and he was struggling with the concepts of income, expenses, and savings. As I explained these things to him, using our own simple budget as an example, I had a moment of clarity. I realized that my own financial education had been a spectacular failure. I had known how to raise capital, how to read a balance sheet, how to calculate a burn rate. But I had known nothing about the true meaning of wealth, about the importance of living within your means, about the difference between needs and wants. I had been a financial expert with a bankrupt soul. This realization sparked an idea. I started a blog, a simple, anonymous blog where I wrote about my experiences. I wrote about the seductive allure of the startup world, about the dangers of chasing success at all costs, about the lessons I had learned in my fall from grace. I wrote about the importance of financial literacy, not as a means to get rich, but as a tool for building a stable, secure, and meaningful life. I wrote about my struggles with debt, my journey to a simpler, more intentional way of living. I didn't expect anyone to read it. I was just writing for myself, a way to process my own experiences, to make sense of the wreckage of my past. But people did read it. My stories resonated with others who had gone through similar experiences, who were struggling with debt, with the pressures of a consumerist culture, with the feeling of being trapped on a treadmill of endless striving. I started to receive emails from people all over the world, thanking me for my honesty, for my vulnerability, for making them feel less alone. The blog grew, slowly at first, then more quickly. I started a small podcast, recording it late at night at the kitchen table after my family was asleep. I would talk about my journey, about the practical steps I was taking to rebuild my financial life, about the philosophical shifts that had changed my perspective on success and happiness. It wasn't about get-rich-quick schemes or stock market tips. It was about something much more fundamental, designing a life that was aligned with your values, a life where money was a tool, not a master. This new venture didn't make me a lot of money. The income from the blog and podcast was modest, a small supplement to my paycheck from the electronics store. But it gave me something that my multi-million-dollar startup had never given me, a sense of purpose. I was helping people. I was turning my greatest failure into a source of strength, a beacon of hope for others. I was no longer just the world's best coder. I was a man who had lost everything and in the process had found a new, more authentic version of himself. My wife was my biggest supporter in this new endeavor. She would read my blog posts before I published them, offering her gentle feedback and encouragement. She saw that this was not about my ego, not about building another empire. This was about healing, about redemption, about using my story to make a positive impact on the world. Our shared purpose brought us even closer together. We were partners in every sense of the word, working together to build a new life, a new future for our family. One day, I received an email from a small, independent publisher. They had been following my blog and were interested in publishing a book based on my story. I was stunned. A book. The thought had never even crossed my mind. I was just a guy who repaired computers, a guy who wrote a blog in his spare time. I wasn't an author, but my wife encouraged me to pursue it. "Your story needs to be told," she said. "You have a voice that people need to hear." And so I began to write. The process was cathartic, a deep dive into the darkest corners of my past. I relived the highs and the lows, the triumphs and the failures, the joy and the heartbreak. I wrote with a brutal honesty, not sparing myself from the harsh judgment of my own mistakes. It was the hardest thing I had ever done, but it was also the most rewarding. As I wrote the final chapter, I looked back at the man I had been, the man who had stood on that bridge ready to give up. And I felt a profound sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the pain, for the struggle, for the failure. Because it was through that fire that I had been forged into a new man. A stronger, wiser, more compassionate man. A man who understood that true wealth is not measured in money, but in love, in connection, in purpose. A man who had finally learned that the greatest legacy you can leave behind is not a company or a fortune, but the love you give and the lives you touch. The book was not a bestseller. It didn't make me rich or famous, but it found its audience. It touched the lives of people who were struggling with the same demons that I had faced, and that was more than enough. The silence that had once filled my life was now a distant memory. My life was filled with noise, the beautiful, chaotic, wonderful noise of a family. The laughter of my children, the gentle murmur of my wife's voice, the sound of my own voice sharing my story, my hope with the world. I had lost everything, but I had gained so much more. I had gained a second chance, and I was going to make the most of it. I still had debt. I still had challenges, but I also had a family that loved me, a purpose that drove me, and a peace in my heart that no amount of money could ever buy. I was no longer chasing a unicorn. I was living a real life, a good life, a life of my own making. And it was beautiful. Years passed. The sharp edges of the past softened, the once raw wounds healing into scars that served as reminders of lessons learned. Life found a comfortable, steady rhythm, a gentle hum that was the polar opposite of the frantic, high-frequency buzz of my former existence. Our little apartment, once a symbol of our downfall, became a cherished home, every corner filled with memories of our rebirth as a family. My son, no longer the angry, hurt boy, grew into a thoughtful and compassionate young man. My daughter, whose hugs had once been so tentative, blossomed into a confident and joyful young woman. They were good kids, kind kids, and watching them grow was my greatest joy. I never went back to the corporate world, to the high-stakes game of startups and venture capital. The allure was gone. I had seen behind the curtain, and I knew that the wizard was just a man with a microphone and a lot of smoke and mirrors. I continued to work at the electronics store, eventually being promoted to manager. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it was stable, it was honest, and it allowed me to be the kind of husband and father I wanted to be. I was home for dinner every night. I never missed a school play or a soccer game. I was present, and that was a promise I had made to my family and to myself, a promise I would never break again. The blog and the podcast became my passion project, my side hustle, my way of paying forward the lessons I had learned. The community that had grown around my story was a source of constant inspiration. I heard from people from all walks of life, entrepreneurs who had lost their businesses, people drowning in credit card debt, couples whose marriages were strained by financial stress. We were a tribe of the fallen, of the broken, of the ones who were trying to put the pieces of their lives back together. And in our shared vulnerability, we found strength. My wife and I, we were a team. The scars of my betrayal had faded, replaced by a deep, abiding love and respect that had been forged in the fires of adversity. We had been through the worst, and we had come out the other side, stronger, more connected, more in love than we had ever been. We were no longer chasing the illusion of a perfect life. We had embraced the messy, imperfect, beautiful reality of our life together. We had learned that the foundation of a strong marriage is not a big house or a fancy car, but a shared commitment to weathering the storms together, to holding on to each other when the winds of fortune blow against you. We eventually managed to pay off all the debt. The day I made the final payment was a quiet, unassuming Tuesday. There were no fireworks, no celebrations, just a profound sense of relief, of a heavy weight finally lifted from my shoulders. I felt like I could finally breathe again after years of holding my breath. We were free. Not rich, not wealthy in the traditional sense, but free. We had enough. And in a world that is constantly screaming at you that you need more, 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 enough is a beautiful, peaceful place to be. One afternoon, I received a message from a young man who had been a junior developer at ConnectSphere. He told me that he was starting his own company, a small, bootstrapped startup with a mission to create technology that would help people, not just addict them. He said that my blog had inspired him, that my story had taught him the importance of building a business with integrity, with a human-centered approach. He asked if I would be willing to be his advisor, to offer him guidance and mentorship. The old me, the arrogant, ego-driven CEO, would have scoffed at the idea. But the new me, the man who had learned that true leadership is about service, not status, was humbled and honored. I met with him, and I saw in his eyes the same passion and drive that I had once had. But there was something else there too, a wisdom and a maturity that I had lacked at his age. I agreed to help him, not as an investor, not as a board member, but as a mentor, a friend. I shared my mistakes, my failures, my hard-won lessons. I helped him navigate the treacherous waters of the startup world, not by teaching him how to raise millions of dollars, but by teaching him how to build a sustainable business, a business that would be a force for good in the world. And in helping him, I found a new sense of purpose. I was not just a survivor of a failed startup. I was a mentor, a guide, a man who could use his own painful experiences to help others avoid the same pitfalls. I was turning my biggest failure into my greatest legacy. One day, my wife and I were sitting on a park bench, watching our kids, now teenagers, throwing a frisbee in the golden light of the setting sun. She turned to me, her hand finding mine, her eyes filled with a warm, gentle love. "Are you happy?" she asked. I thought about her question for a moment. I thought about the man I used to be, the man who had a $10 million house and a heart full of emptiness. I thought about the man I was now, the man who had a small apartment and a heart full of love. "Yes," I said, my voice thick with emotion. I truly am. I had lost a company, but I had found a calling. I had lost a fortune, but I had found a richness beyond my wildest dreams. I had lost the world, but I had gained my soul. The journey had been long, painful, and filled with regret, but I wouldn't change a thing. Because it was the journey that had brought me here to this moment, to this park bench, with this woman, with this family, with this life. A life that was not perfect, not glamorous, not what I had once dreamed of, but a life that was real, a life that was good, a life that was mine. And it was more than enough. It was everything. Thanks for listening to my story. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments and tell me which country you're from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this.